Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Completing and Interpreting the ASA Statement, a block-by-block discussion. And as the title implies, we will, in fact, be going through block by block in this training. For those of you that are unaware of what ASA has been doing, we have been working for the last several years on developing standardized documentation template with an instruction set to go with it. As you all know, aviation safety documentation is continuously evolving. It's evolving on the airworthiness side. As you can see on your screen, you can see on the left side the Form 183. I think that is a 1936 form that was filled out almost 85 years ago. And on the right side, you see the current authorized release certificate form 8130-3, which many of you are familiar with. Similarly, just like aviation safety documentation is evolving, commercial documentation is also evolving. The ASA statement is a documentation template that represents an evolution in commercial documentation. It is not a revolution. There's not any radical change going on here. Rather, what you've got is a document that was created by a team of ASA members and non-members who are interested in coalescing the sort of commercially useful information that is most often sought after in transactions. Now, during this presentation, you're going to see normal text, and the normal text is typically information that is taken directly out of the published standard. You will also see italicized text, as you see throughout this slide. When you see italicized text in this presentation, that is typically descriptive information that we've added for purposes of the presentation that is not taken directly out of the standard. You will see titles in each of the slides. They're meant to provide guidance as to the topics that we're talking about. They don't necessarily follow the presentation standards. Also, the footers do not follow these standards. So just to illustrate what we're talking about, frequently on the slide, you will see an image of the ASA statement form. This is taken directly from the template that is found in the standard. You will see normal text, as you see in the middle where the arrow is pointing to. The normal text is taken verbatim out of the standard. And you'll see italicized text. And that's additional descriptive information that describes the statement and the rules for the statement. So let's introduce you to the ASA statement. This is the document that you see here in front of you. It's meant to be a common industry document that will convey information about aircraft parts. It's meant to provide information in a very unambiguous manner, and part of the way that we do that is by carefully defining what goes in this form in the instruction set that goes with the form. One of the reasons that this was developed was to respond to common industry complaints that have been raised with respect to other template and non-template documents found within the industry. It's a commercial document. Because it's a commercial document, any seller can complete it. It does not need any special government certification to complete it. By the same token, though, it does not carry the same sort of government imprimatur that government documents like the 8130-3 carry. This statement is intended to be a living document. The statement and the statement instructions will be monitored and maintained by the ASA Quality Committee to make sure that the statement continues to be relevant and continues to provide the sort of support to the industry that the industry expects. Just to repeat, it is not an airworthiness document, and it doesn't take the place of airworthiness documents. It is merely a commercial document. There are a number of limitations that are imposed within the four corners of the instruction set. The ASA statement is not intended to be used for complete aircraft engines, or propellers. So that is to say products. It's not intended to document transactions for non-aviation articles. It's meant to be for aircraft parts. It's not intended to be used as a maintenance release, nor as an approval for return to service. It's not intended to be, nor is it intended to replace, a government airworthiness approval. So anyone who uses the ASA statement for an unintended or unanticipated purpose, so if you violate these limitations, for example, then you should create your own set of rules that apply to the unintended or unanticipated use. And the reason for this is because since those are unintended or unanticipated uses, our instruction set doesn't adequately cover them. The instruction set is meant to cover aircraft parts. And if I can digress for just a moment, for those of you that are watching this live, you will notice that there is a chat feature on the side that you can pull up. If you pull up the chat feature, you will see that there are links in the chat feature to both the instruction set and to a fillable version of the form. Both the instructions and the separate fillable version of the form, it's a fillable PDF, can be found on ASA's website at aviationsuppliers.org. So let's look at some of the general rules that apply to the ASA statement. It's intended to be completed by a seller. This was a matter of much debate within the committee that developed it. If the article is intended to be shipped from a location other than the seller's location, the seller is still responsible for the complete ASA statement. So, for example, in a drop shipment situation, the document would either be completed by the seller and conveyed to the drop shipment location so that it could be associated with the part, or it would be completed by a seller's representative, someone who is authorized to sign for the seller at the drop shipment location. The ASA statement may be represented in an electronic format or in a paper format or in any other format that can be reasonably produced and transferred. The ASA statement, as a matter of general principle, should be completed in English. The reason that we have selected English is because English is assigned as the ICAO standard language of aviation. Normally, the ASA statement should remain with the article to which it refers once it's been associated with that article. If the ASA statement is removed from the article, then you can reassociate it with the article if you have some way to uniquely reassociate it. So if you have a unique identifier like a serial number or a barcode that's placed on the article and associated with the ASA statement. Digital ASA statements should be identified in such a way that they can be uniquely associated with an article, using unique identifiers such as serial numbers or other unique identifiers that may be applied. If you have an article that does not intrinsically include a unique identifier, and you want to use a digital ASA statement, then the seller or any other party can provide a unique identifier, so long as the provision of this unique identifier does not violate regulatory or legal standards. An example would be if you have parts that are sealed in a packaging, then obviously you can apply a label with a barcode or two-dimensional symbology or other unique identifier. What we advise against is taking any sort of step that might modify or alter a part unless you have A, the appropriate certifications to perform that work, and B, the appropriate instructions to perform that sort of work. There are a number of abbreviations that are used in the ASA statement. I would like to highlight two of them. NA means not applicable, and you will see that throughout the instruction set, we advise that if a form block would otherwise be left blank, it instead be filled in with NA for not applicable. The one place where you're going to see that diverge is in the manufacturer block. We use NR for not required. And that would indicate that the manufacturer is either unknown or undisclosed. There is a glossary of defined terms, and many of the terms that are used throughout this standard are defined or described in the glossary. So if you run into a term and you're not sure how to interpret that term, you can actually turn in the instruction sets to the glossary at the end and potentially find some additional guidance in that glossary. So we promised you a block by block analysis of this, and let's jump right in with blocks 1 and 2. Blocks 1 and 2 are intended to be buyer's information. You're going to find them in the upper left-hand corner. The idea is that that is typically the first place where most people are going to look for information as they scan through the document. So when a buyer receives a part, the buyer's receiving inspector should be able to look for the buyer's information first in those blocks 1 and 2 in the upper left-hand corner. So block 1 is going to be a buyer's purchase reference number. Oftentimes it might be a purchase order number, but it can be any other buyer's purchase reference number that the buyer has used in the transaction. The idea of this, the purpose of this block, is to permit the buyer to easily correlate the article when they receive it to their intended purchase and to their purchase records. If the buyer did not provide a purchase reference, then this block can be completed as NA for not applicable. Block number 2, immediately below that, is going to be the block for the buyer's name. If the buyer is a corporation or the legal entity, this would normally be the corporate name or the doing business name that identifies the buyer. What it should not typically be would be the buyer's agent's name. So if the buyer's agent is an individual who is a purchasing agent, but they are purchasing on behalf of the corporate entity, then normally you would have the corporate entity's name in block 2. Block 3 is the form title. The form title is ASA Statement Form 2020. The ASA Statement Form 2020 should not be changed. As a person that is a seller and completing this form, typically you won't change block 3 at all. As a buyer that is receiving this form, if the form says something other than ASA Statement Form 2020, then that means that this is not an ASA Statement Form 2020, and the ASA Statement Form 2020 instructions may not or do not apply to this form. Blocks 4 through 10 are meant to provide seller's information. Starting with block 4, this is the seller's name. As with the buyer's name, if it is a corporate entity, you should represent the corporate entity's name in this block. So that would include corporations, LLCs, anything else that has a legal existence separate from the individuals that represent it. Block 5 would be the seller's contact phone number. In the event that the buyer has questions, they should be able to use this seller's phone number to ask their questions and to make contact with the seller. Block 6 is the seller's email. Once again, a contact point for the seller. Block 7 would be the seller's website. This would be yet another contact point for the seller, and would allow the buyer to find out additional information about the seller. In some cases, the terms and conditions of sale may be found on the seller's website, and that's another reason why this may be useful information. For each of these that we've been talking about, the blocks can be completed as NA not applicable if the seller does not want to provide the information. So all of this seller's information is considered to be something that the seller may choose not to provide. If the seller has another contact mechanism, then we can provide some other seller contact in block 8. Again, this can be left as NA. And as we said earlier, the reason that each of these blocks can be completed as NA is because a blank block raises a question: was it purposely left blank or mistakenly left blank? Whereas if you complete it with NA, then it is clear that the seller did not intend to provide this information. If the seller has their own reference number, then the seller's reference goes in block 9. This would be a sales order number, contract number, or any other reference within the seller's system that would allow the seller to easily find the sales information within their system. And obviously the purpose of this seller's information or seller's reference block is to allow the seller to easily correlate this statement to a sales record. Block 10 is for the seller's contact address. This is the address that the seller wishes to be contacted through. This address may be different than the address from which the article is shipped. So that was blocks 4 through 10, the seller's information. Blocks 11 through 13 represent historical information. They're basically part of the audit trail for the part, and they are audit trail information items that typically have been identified as useful to the installer in other transactions. So you can see these history blocks circled in red on the left and blown up on the right, blocks 11 through 13. They provide historical information that may be useful to an installer, and typically at least one will be completed. The seller may complete all of the blocks or none of the blocks, and they may apply the phrase NA for not applicable to any 1, 2, or 3 of the blocks at the seller's discretion. So block 11 is the obtained from block. You should use this block 11 to list the immediately previous source from which the seller obtained the article. This block helps to create an audit trail for the article by pointing to the immediately previous possessor of the part. Note that the immediately previous possessor may not have been the owner of the article. For example, if the article was owned by Airline X, but held as a consignment by distributor Y, and the seller received the article from distributor Y, then the seller should list distributor Y as its obtained from source. If the seller wishes to indicate someone else in the chain of commerce, for example, a prior operator who is not the immediately previous source, then this information should be indicated in block 13, which is the traceable to block. This block may be completed as NA, not applicable. If completed as NA, then the seller should maintain on file sufficient information to provide an audit trail for the article consistent with the requirements of the seller's quality system. Block 12 is our entity of last certification. In this block, you would want to enter the name of the entity that issued the last government-sanctioned airworthiness release or approval for the article. So some examples of what the last certification might be. It could be an authorized release from a maintenance or alteration. This is typically required to be documented under the National Aviation Authority's maintenance rules. So for example, if it had been done under United States FAA rules, then it would typically be documented as a Part 43 approval for return to service, which is often documented on an 8130-3. The last certification could be an inspection by a certificated person. Again, this is typically required to be documented under the National Aviation Authority's maintenance rules. It could also be a release from a production approval holder system. This may or may not be documented. So for example, under the European Aviation Safety Agency's system, EASA's system, production approval holders are expected to document release with an EASA Form 1. In the United States, production approval holders are encouraged, but not required, to document the release on an 8130-3. This could also be a government airworthiness finding, such as an airworthiness finding issued by an authorized government employee or by a designee of the government. So in the United States, that could be signed by an FAA employee, or it could be signed by a designated airworthiness representative or other qualified designee. And the last certification described in Block 12 could also come from any other approval issued by a person that is granted the authority to issue approvals by the appropriate government agency. And in this case, when we say government agency, we really mean NAA, or National Aviation Authority. Now, Block 12 shouldn't be used to name an entity that didn't issue a government-sanctioned airworthiness release or approval. For example, if the part went through an air carrier's inventory, but the air carrier never issued a government approval, such as an 8130-3 for that part, then that air carrier should not be listed in Block 12, although you could list that air carrier in Block 13. If you have a part that is in as is or as removed condition or a similar condition, also if you have a consumable part, raw material, or standard part, then this block should be completed as NA, because in each case, the entity of last certification either doesn't exist, which would be the case for consumables, raws, and standard parts, or the entity of last certification, the certification is no longer directly valid for a part that is currently in an as is or as removed condition. Block 13 is the traceable to block. And in this block, you'd want to enter the name of any entity that previously owned or possessed the article, any prior source. The purpose of this block is to provide additional information that may be useful to an installer or other person in the subsequent chain of commerce. For example, if an as-removed part was obtained from an intermediate source, like the disassembly facility, then the seller may believe that the name of the operator from whom the aircraft, the article was removed, may be useful information to some buyers. In such a case, the seller may name the air carrier as a traceable to source. Generally speaking, if you're going to fill out Block 13, you should have credible evidence that the entity previously owned or possessed the article. You do not need back to birth traceability to support a traceable to entry. That is typically not required unless back to birth traceability is a commercial condition of sale of the article. There may be more than one party that could be listed in this block. If there is more than one party that could be listed in this block, then the choice of the entity is entirely at the discretion of the seller. The choice will often be guided by the seller's unilateral belief that the information may be useful downstream in the stream of commerce. As with blocks 11 and 12, block 13 also may be completed as NA. And just to reiterate, you can fill out 11, 12, and 13 as NA if you are a seller and you believe that you do not want to provide or cannot provide historical information. So let's look at some examples. And one of the reasons that I want to look at these examples is because sometimes you have a choice of more than one piece of data to place into a block. So on the next two slides after this one, I'm going to show you some examples. Where the examples show a choice in how to complete a block, the choice will typically be at the discretion of the seller. The seller's discretion, obviously for commercial reasons, can be influenced by the buyer and by negotiations between the buyer and seller. So each of the following examples is assuming a non-life limited article. In our first bulleted example, the seller, who we'll call X, obtains a new article from a repair station R that purchased it directly from the production approval holder M. R performed no work on the article. They bought a new article, it went into the inventory, and then they sold it from their inventory to X. The seller may identify R in block 11. So repair station R is the obtained from entity. They may identify M in block 12, the entity of last certification, and they may identify either M or R in block 13. Remember that the seller is also free to enter NA in any one or two or all three of these blocks. So let's move down one to our second bullet. In our second example, the seller is X. The seller X obtained the overhauled article directly from a repair station R that purchased it directly from an air carrier AC. R performed the overhaul on the article after purchasing it from AC. They have credible documentation that shows that the article was produced by production approval holder M, but X does not have complete back-to-birth traceability on this article. Under these circumstances, the seller may identify R in block 11 because that was the party from whom they obtained the unit. They can identify either AC or M or R in block 13. And they would identify R in block 12. So R is the last entity to certificate this part because they issued an approval for return to service for the overhaul. So R goes in 12. And in 13, again, AC, M, or R, all three of them are valid traceable to sources. Now, in the example, we put down traceable to air carrier AC, but we could have chosen one of the other entities. Why would we choose AC? Because the seller believes that that is commercially useful information to a subsequent buyer. So let's turn to the next slide and look at some more examples. The first of these examples, we have seller X. Seller obtained the new article directly from an auction house, AH. AH represented a bankrupt air carrier, but provided no air carrier documentation to X. Credible documentation shows that the article was produced by a production approval holder M, but X does not have back-to-birth traceability. The seller would identify the auction house as the obtained from entity under this circumstance. The seller may identify AH in block 11. They may identify M, the manufacturer, in block 12, because we specified it was a new article and we have credible documentation to show that it was produced by that production approval holder. And then finally, the seller may identify either AH or M in block 13. And actually, that is incomplete. The seller can also identify the air carrier in block 13 because the seller knows that the part came from the bankrupt air carrier. And actually, I apologize that that is incomplete, and we should probably go back and revise the standard to make that complete. But we've got a similar item in the next bullet point down, where we have a seller who obtains a new article directly from a now defunct air carrier, EA. So EA is out of business. EA had obtained the article from a still currently existing airline, AC. Credible documentation shows that the article was produced by a production approval holder, M, but X does not have back-to-birth traceability. The seller can identify EA in block 11 because that's the air carrier from whom they obtained it. They can identify M because M would be the entity of last certification of this new article. And then finally, they can identify either AC, the air carrier, EA, the now defunct air carrier, or M in block 13. All three, AC, EA, and M, are in the chain of commerce, and we have documentation to show that they were in the chain of commerce, and therefore we have credible evidence to show that it is traceable to any of those three. So that's our blocks 11 through 13. The next block that we get to, or the next set of blocks, is the information that identifies the article itself, and that's blocks 14 through 18. So in blocks 14 through 18, we're going to use these to provide identifying information about the article. Let's start from the left with block 14, the manufacturer's block. In the manufacturer's block, we'll state the producer of the article in this block. Sometimes this can be a little ambiguous to distinguish between who is a production approval holder versus a manufacturer versus a supplier. So we have some rather specific instructions here. If the article was manufactured by a supplier to a production approval holder and then subsequently produced by the production approval holder under that production approval, then you should name the production approval holder in this block. If the article has not been produced under production approval, then it is acceptable to name a non-production approval holder as the manufacturer. So for example, a standard part, you would name the standard part producer if that part never went through a production approval system. The seller may choose not to identify a manufacturer, such as when the seller can't identify the manufacturer. In such a case, the seller should complete this block with the term NR, not required, rather than NA, not applicable. So the next block is our part number. You should state the part number or the applicable specification in this block. If the article has more than one part number, then use the one that is most closely associated with the manufacturer described in block 14. So for example, sometimes you'll see supplied parts where the supplier had their own part number and then the production approval holder had a different part number. If you named the production approval holder in block 14, then you should use the production approval holder's number rather than the supplier's number in block 15. If you have other part numbers and wish to name them, you should name the other part numbers in block 20. If the article does not have a part number, such as a unique item produced for a custom interior, then the seller may complete this block with NA. Block 16 is our nomenclature or description. Here you would describe the article in this block. This is another area where oftentimes there are various nomenclatures that might be used. You should prefer the nomenclature used in the Illustrated Parts Catalog or other OEM reference, but any accurate description will be acceptable. So we state a preference, but we accept anything that is an accurate description. Block 17 is quantity. Here you would describe the quantity of articles in the shipment. This block can be used to describe a numerical quantity, such as, 100 would mean 100 units of the part described. But you can also use this to describe a quantity that is not measured as a count. So for example, if you're shipping a liquid, the quantity might be 2 liters. In order to minimize ambiguities, you should use units in conjunction with your number. So if you're shipping 2 liters of something, then you should indicate 2 liters. Don't just write 2. And then block 18 is a space for a serial number or other identifier. This block can be used for any unique identifier associated with the article. It can be used for a serial number, a batch number, a lot number, or any other unique identifier. If the article bears more than one unique identifier, then each identifier may be listed. If it's unclear what the identifier represents, then clarify the meaning in the remarks block. If you have a non-serialized part, and it is intended to be correlated to an electronic record or a digital record, then the party may assign a unique identifier for the correlation purposes. Remember, we mentioned earlier that one example of this would be if the part is sealed in a packaging, then you may want to apply a label with a barcode on the packaging with a unique identifier associated with it. A unique identifier for correlation purposes may be included in this block. Blocks 19 through 20 represent information identifying the condition of the article. Block 19 is our status block. You would use block 19 to describe the article's current status. The article's status will typically be derived from supporting documentation, from a government determination, or from a determination by an appropriate holder of a government-issued certificate, such as a production approval holder or a maintenance certificate holder. Unless the seller has defined another term, then you should only use one of the following terms. And all of these terms are taken from government defined terms. So the authorized terms are altered, as is, as removed, inspected, inspected/tested, modified, new, overhauled, prototype, rebuilt, or repaired. Each of these terms is described in the glossary. So if you're wondering what term to use and you're hovering between two different terms, then look at the glossary to see what the terms mean. And oftentimes the terms might have similar meanings. So for example, altered and modified are very similar, altered having come from the United States regulatory system and modified from the European regulatory system. If the seller uses a different term from this list, if the seller uses a different term, then the seller is responsible for indicating the source of the definition for the term that is used in the remarks block. And that can either be a definition of the term, or it can be a cross-reference to a source of the definition. Now our remarks block is block 20. Block 20 is a free-form block for indicating any other useful information associated with the article. Some examples of useful information might include airworthiness directive status, identifiers for the aircraft from which the used article was removed, an identifier of any special condition that may apply to the article. These three are mere examples. They are not requirements. Nothing is specifically required in Block 20. It is really a free-form block for additional useful information. The seller must ensure that it has adequate evidence to support any assertion that's made in Block 20. If no other entry is made in the block, then the block must be completed as NA in order to clarify that there are no remarks. That brings us to the article identity certifications. These are blocks 21, 22, and 23. And which of these you fill out is actually going to be driven by block 19 and the information you put there. So let's take a look at these article identity certifications. These blocks are used to certify information about the article. Any blocks that are inapplicable may be shaded or crossed out for clarity at the discretion of the seller completing this. The certification block is going to be driven by the information in block 19. If block 19 says new, then you're going to use block 21. If block 19 says anything else, then you're going to use blocks 22 and 23. So block 21 is the certification for new articles. This certification language should not be changed unless you consult with an attorney and make the change in your own derivative form. Once you've changed this language, though, it is no longer the ASA Statement Form 2020. One of the reasons that we ask people not to change this without adopting your own form and diverging from ASA Statement Form 2020 is because we want the receiving inspectors to know what certifications are being made. And if this language remains constant and common, then it makes it easier for receiving inspectors to understand what the certification means. So you'll notice that block 21 says, to the best of the seller's knowledge, each article listed above is a new, unused article, and the information in this form is accurate. So, as a receiving inspector, if you see that block 19 says new, you know that the certification of block 21 applies to it and that the article is actually being certified as being new, unused, and that the information in the form is accurate. If block 19 says anything else other than new, then blocks 22 and 23 apply. Blocks 22 and 23 are certifications for everything else. The certification language in block 22 says, to the best of the seller's knowledge, each article listed above is in the condition or status shown in block 19. So we're certifying that 19 is accurate. And the information in this form is accurate. So all we're doing is certifying that block 19 is true and the rest of the form is accurate. Once again, don't change block 22 because the consistency of block 22 allows the receiving inspectors to better understand what certifications are being made. Then block 23 is a public use aircraft disclosure. This is another one where you shouldn't change the language without consulting with an attorney about those ramifications. And what you will want to do is check the appropriate box. The certification language says, to the best of the seller's knowledge, each article listed above either was or was not previously installed in a public aircraft such as a government use aircraft or a military aircraft. For clarity, You may also cross out the inapplicable words, but the first priority is to check the checkbox for the words that do apply in this situation. This may raise the question of why do we care about public use aircraft? And the reason is because under international standards, particularly those published by the International Civil Aviation Organization, public use aircraft are not required to be operated nor maintained to civil aircraft standards. Because of this, the condition of used parts from public use aircraft may vary from normal civil use aircraft standards. Now, many countries have opted to maintain their type certificated public use aircraft to civil aircraft standards. The United States government did this in the 1990s. They published Government Services Administration, or General Services Administration, GSA standards, directing all of the civil agencies to maintain their aircraft and operate them as if they were FAA certificated aircraft. The reason that the US government did this in the 90s was to ensure that the US government assets retained their value. Because of this, the public use declaration may not be dispositive of airworthiness. So you can have something that is removed from a US government public use aircraft, and you say that it was a public use, you make the public use declaration, you state that it was from a public use aircraft, but please bear in mind that if the aircraft was operated to FAA standard and maintained to FAA standards, then the mere fact that it was public use may not adversely impact the airworthiness of the part. Block 24 is our incident clearance statement. So the incident clearance statement, in its basic form, was developed outside of ASA. The International Air Transport Association, IATA, approached ASA and asked us if there was a way that ASA could better promote the incident clearance statement. The statement at that point in time was being used for complete aircraft and complete engines. We have incorporated a part-specific version of the incident clearance statement. So you may notice that it's a little bit different from the complete aircraft version, and that's because it's a part-specific version. This is an additional certification for articles that shouldn't be changed in order to maintain consistency within this form. The idea is that you want to check the appropriate box, and there are 3 boxes that could be checked, and the instructions go through and explain in detail how to analyze a part and determine which of these boxes gets checked. It is permissible for clarity to cross out the assertions that do not apply, but it is, of course, not required. For purposes of these instructions, an accident or incident subject to mandatory reporting means one that was subject to mandatory reporting under Annex 13 to the Chicago Convention. So here I've blown up Block 24 a little bit more so that you can see it a little bit more easily. You will see that the incident clearance statement states that to the best of the seller's knowledge, either A or B or C applies. So if the seller is indicated new in Block 19, then you should be completing this block by checking either 24B or 24C. So 24C is for new unused articles that have not been subject to damage, stress, heat, or unusual environmental conditions that might reasonably have affected their airworthiness condition. So if you have a new part and no reason to believe that it has been damaged or degraded, then you can check Block C. If you have a new part, but you know that it's been subjected to damage, stress, heat, or unusual environmental conditions, let's say that it was immersed in water, or it was dropped and may have been damaged. Let's say that it was in a warehouse fire. Under those circumstances, you would want to identify your new part under B, an article that may or may not have been subject to damage, stress, heat, or unusual environmental conditions that render their airworthiness condition unknown, and a hidden damage assessment or other inspection may be advisable before installation. So this would be for parts that might have been damaged, might have had their airworthiness compromised, and therefore require some inspection before they're installed. So that would be for new parts going to either 24B or 24C. If the seller knows that there was an occurrence that required a hidden damage inspection, then the seller should always be checking 24B. And I'm sorry, the example on the slide says 23B, that should be 24B. So if you've got parts subjected to a warehouse fire that might have adversely impacted the parts, check 24B in order to warn the installers that they need to check these parts before they install them. So this page gives you rules for new articles. Let's take a look now at the rules for other than new articles. For other than new articles, and this is anything other than new in block 19, then you want to complete this either by checking 24A or 24B. 24C is specific to new parts, so 24C does not apply for this analysis. If the seller knows that there was an occurrence that required a hidden damage inspection, then check box 24B. And again, I apologize. It says 23B. We'll make sure that that gets corrected. If the article is not new, but it's known to be currently in an airworthy condition, then check box 24A. So 24A says that none of the parts above have either been damaged or subjected to severe stress, but there is an or clause that says that if they've been damaged or subject to severe stress or heat, then if the airworthiness status of the article was reestablished by an approved maintenance organization in accordance with instructions acceptable to the authority or authorities with oversight jurisdiction, then you can still check 24A. So let's say that you have a part that, let's say it's an engine part, and there was something that occurred with the engine that required a special inspection. You've performed the special hidden damage inspection and found that there, in fact, or a repair station has performed the hidden damage inspection and found that there was no adverse effect on the part. Now you can still check 24A because any sort of adverse effect has been investigated, and it's been found that there was no adverse effect to airworthiness. So essentially, this would be parts that either don't have an incident or did have some sort of occurrence, and subsequent to the occurrence were confirmed to be currently airworthy. If you have an as-is article where the airworthiness status of the article is currently unknown, or if the airworthiness status of the article is in question, then check box 24B. And once again, I know my slide says 23B, but it should say 24B. This alerts installers that the article must be inspected and potentially repaired as necessary before being installed. So we've already sort of alluded to this, but the key feature of this incident clearance statement is that you can clear a part after a hidden damage inspection. So if the article was damaged, subsequently inspected for damage, repaired as necessary, and cleared of all the potential and hidden damage, then you can check 24A. So you can actually have a part that was adversely affected, and that part might be overhauled It might complete all hidden damage inspections and appropriate repairs be applied. And following that overhaul process, you can still check 24A to indicate that any sort of potential damage has been cleared through the inspections and repairs. And obviously, as this statement states, both the inspection and the repair must be accomplished in accordance with instructions that are acceptable to the appropriate oversight authority. And the data must be acceptable to the oversight authority. In some cases, for major repairs and major alterations, the data may need to be approved. If the work in question was done under the authority of multiple authorities, then this will often be disclosed in the approval for return to service document. So let's just summarize this block 24. You're checking 24 articles that are not currently affected by an occurrence. That includes things that were affected, were repaired or overhauled in order to return them to an airworthy condition. And this lets future users know that the part matches the condition shown in block 19 with no reservations. You would want to check 24B for any articles that may have been exposed to a potential damage or whose airworthiness is unknown if they have not been returned to an airworthy condition. This lets future users know that this part has to be properly inspected and may need to be repaired before it can be used. And then you would want to check 24C for new articles that have not been exposed to potential damage. And that again lets future users know that the part's in a new condition and has not been exposed to damage potential. Block 25 is where we get down to our certifications and signatures. Block 25 is standard certification language. And again, we ask that people not change this. By not changing block 25, it allows receiving inspectors to know what block 25 is certifying. And as you can see, it certifies that the signature below confirms, on behalf of the seller named above, that the information in this form is true to the best of the seller's knowledge. So we're not going out on a limb and saying anything outside the scope of this document. All we're saying is that the document is true to the best of our knowledge. Block 26 is where you're going to find your signature. This is the signature of the natural person who's named in the next block, block 27. The signature on here means that that person is affirming that the information on the statement is true and correct to the best of the signer's knowledge and also to the best of the seller's knowledge. So they're imputing to the signer the corporate knowledge. Block 27 is the name of the natural person who signed in block 26. Block 28 is an identifier. This would be either a unique identifier such as an employee number or a stamp or any other identifier that is assigned to the natural person. If the natural person does not have a unique identifier assigned to him or her, then this block can be completed as NA. Block 29 would be the date. This is the date on which the statement was signed. The preference is for the ISO 8601 date format, which is year in 4 digits, hyphen month in 2 digits, hyphen day in 2 digits. Any other format is acceptable as long as it is unambiguous. And remember that different cultures may have different date orders for date fields. Aviation is an international industry, so please use a format that is unambiguous. So for example, if you saw 12/11/12, it could represent December 11th, 2012 in some parts of the world, but it also might represent November 12th, 2012 in other parts of the world. And because different readers can have different expectations, something like that is going to be considered ambiguous. So if you're going to diverge from the ISO standard, please use something that is utterly unambiguous to represent the date. Block 30 is our notice of limitations. So block 30 is the notice at the bottom of the form. This is notice language for all articles. We recommend that you do not change this language because, again, it is standardized language that provides useful information to the subsequent holders of the part. It states, this document makes no independent representation that the part is airworthy or that it is acceptable for installation. These determinations are to be made by the installer based upon an inspection of the part and its related evidence. The statement goes on to say that form instructions are available at the aviationsuppliers.org website. So this document, or this statement, this notice, is intended to limit the seller's liability with respect to airworthiness consistent with the installer's obligations under normal installation rules, like 14 CFR section 4313 in the United States and 145.A.42 in the European Union. If you put a statement in the remarks block that is inconsistent with this, then that statement will probably dominate. It will trump this disclaimer. So, for example, if the notice continues to say that the document makes no independent representation that the part is airworthy, and you write in block 20, I promise that the part is airworthy, that is an explicit warranty that is likely to eliminate this disclaimer. There is a notion in the legal system that the courts abhor a disclaimer. So if there's a disclaimer and something that contradicts the disclaimer, usually the other statement will be looked upon as a de facto warranty. So this doesn't limit liability with respect to the explicit statements that are made on this face of the form, but please note that this notice is very much comparable to the notice found on documents like the 8130-3 tag and the ASA Form 1. So as a consequence, it is a notice that should be fairly commonly acceptable and understood within the industry. So the notice does reference the fact that the form instructions are available on aviationsuppliers.org. The reason that it has this URL is because we want to make sure that everyone in the industry who receives one of these forms can find the instruction set so that they can easily interpret the form, and also so that they can easily complete the form if they're going to complete one of these. So now we open the floor up to questions, and unfortunately I don't think that I can see the questions unless I stop presenting. Actually,
that's okay, Jason. I'll go ahead. I'll keep an eye on the chat.
Okay.
And also, Sam, people can unmute themselves to ask the question.
That's correct.
There's a question from John Dorian. John, do you want to unmute yourself and ask it, or do you want me to read it?
Yeah, I can ask it. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
No, it's regarding block 19. Many of them don't break down the serviceability, affect it, modified, repaired, or test it, but use the catch-all phrase of serviceable. Would that be a term we use at our own discretion, or would that be something the ASA considers a valid term?
So the word serviceable was discussed within the committee that developed these instructions. The FAA has at times in the past actually asked the industry not to use the word serviceable. And the FAA's rationale is that it's not a defined term. one of the things that I've encountered in the industry is that different companies have slightly different ideas of what the word serviceable means. So as a consequence, what we did is, rather than trying to come up with a uniform definition for the word serviceable, we left that as one of the undefined terms, such that if a company wants to use it, the company has to provide their own definition of what they mean when they say use the word serviceable. I'll assume that that fully answers your question, since there was no follow-up.
Yeah, thank
Jason, Roy Resto said on the ASA website, the form does not appear to have the disclaimer at the bottom or in the instructions. So,
We can check that, Sam.
okay. I'll make a note. Thank you, Roy.
Jason, there doesn't appear to be any other questions.
Awesome. Well, thanks, everyone. We really appreciate you being with us. And if there are other questions that come up, please let us know. We intend this to be a living document. We intend it to be something that the ASA Quality Committee will oversee, and they will recommend amendments to the instruction set as more guidance becomes necessary. So if you see problems with this, if you see opportunities with this, please let us know what the problems and opportunities are so that we can take advantage of them and we can help the industry be as safe and as competitive as possible.
Jason, Roy did, sorry, as you were talking, a question came in.
Oh,
Roy, you want to ask your question?
Right. A couple of questions is, so I'm working with somebody and they say that their customer requires them to issue a material certification. And they say they've been normally issuing their, the ATA Spec 106. And their question is, will they now have to issue the ATA Spec 106 in the ASA form? Or do they issue the ASA form, and will that satisfy the customer's requirement for a material certification? And could you comment on the volunteer aspect of implementing the form in the first place? Thanks.
sure. Well, first of all, we're not really in a position to force anyone to use any particular form. If someone's contract requires a different form, then they'll issue a different form. Our intent, though, is for this to be a standard commercial form that everyone would begin to use, so that in the transaction that you described, hopefully the buyer would accept this form as an adequate commercial material certification from the distributor that is selling the articles. One of the reasons that we created this is because some of the forms that are being used in the industry as material certifications either A, have language in them that is outdated and actually represents statements that the company doesn't necessarily want to make. So for example, I've seen companies with standard material certifications that verify that the part meets US production approval holder requirements when the part was actually produced by a European production approval holder. That's clearly a mismatch, and we've designed this form to avoid those sort of mismatches. But the other issue is that sometimes forms have instruction sets that are dramatically out of date. And we wanted this to be an instruction set that is both current and also will be a living instruction set that is updated as new questions arise. We hope that the instructions will be amended to address those questions. The third issue, though, is that sometimes forms are based on instruction sets that no one can get their hands on. and we want to make sure that this is available to be downloaded. It'll be easy to find on ASA's website, and most importantly, it'll be a free download. No one has to pay for these instructions, and that way, receiving inspectors and sellers who are completing the form should be able to easily complete the form and know what the form means when they complete it or receive it. So for these reasons, we think that there's a number of advantages to using this form. And going back to your original question, while we would never say that anyone has to use any one form, and commercial partners can decide what they feel is relevant, we believe that this form should meet the requirements of the two parties that you mentioned in your hypothetical.
Can I ask another question?
Absolutely, Roy.
Okay. No, I was just wondering for the popular marketplace ERP system providers. I'll just hope you don't mind me mentioning a few, like Pentagon, AppSite, and Quantum, for example. Is there going to be any effort to reach out to those guys to see if they could assist us with automating the form? You know, like if you had the data in your ERP system, could you just generate the form from the data in your ERP system, you know, and automate it in that way? That, I think that would really help a lot in promulgating the popularity of the form.
Jason,
Well, Roy,
is it okay?
they say, oh, I'm sorry, Michelle, were you going to answer
Is
that?
it all right if I quickly chime in?
Sure.
Great, thank you. Just for everyone on the call to know that yes, the ASA Board of Directors has been taking the leadership on this, and we've been contacting all of the providers that we're aware of and working with them, and you will hopefully start to see announcements from those providers that they'll incorporate the form into their system. But we've identified that as a need, and we've been working closely with several of the directors on accomplishing that goal. Sorry, Roy, you can keep asking questions.
Pesky questions. No, these are really easy ones. So as far as people that are, for example, ASA 100 accredited, whether they implement this or not, based on what I heard you say, has nothing to do with their accreditation status, correct?
Oh, this is intended to be used by anyone, accredited or not. And we will certainly encourage everyone in the industry.
AKA 106 cert. They're basically the ASA cert.
Hold on one second. Someone has their microphone on. It's carrying. I think it's been muted, Jason.
Okay. So yeah, Roy, this is not just for ASA members. It's not just for accredited companies. This really is a form that is intended to be used by anyone in the industry. And that's one of the reasons why we've made it available for free and made the instructions available for free on our website in order to make it easy for companies to make use of this.
And just to be clear, it is not a requirement for ASA 100 accreditation. Roy, do you still need the mic?
I'm good. Thank you so much.
Let's see. So I now have the chat up and I don't see any new questions in the chat. If anyone else has any questions though, feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask.
Jason, I don't think there's any other questions. So thank you for the presentation.
Oh, hey, thank you all for being part of this. And thank you, Michelle, for all the leadership that you've shown in putting this together, putting the committees together, getting international support as well as domestic support, getting Air Carrier, International Trade Association, manufacturer, distributor, and repair station support for this project. It's really been fantastic the way you've brought together all of the relevant parties in order to make this standard a reality.
Great, thank you, Jason. And if anyone has any questions, of course, email us afterwards and we'll check Roy's comment about the website. But thank you.